This video is a follow-up to my CW Jot Talk number 19, which live streamed last Sunday, and in which I discussed the possible meanings of Psalm 22:16 or 17, depending on which Bible translation you use. And I'm going to, in this video, focus on the term used in the Nahal Hever Psalms fragment, references 5/6, Nahal Hever Psalms, and whether it reads ka'ari, like in the Masoretic texts that are commonly used and that are translated like a lion, or does it read ka'abru with a wa at the end versus a yod and mean something like to dig out? So I'm going to play a portion of a video that was sent to me after I posted my video and that was published on April 29, 2019 by Yosi Feigenbaum. And let's listen to what he has to say. I'll make various comments at different points. And ultimately, I'm going to focus on what the Nahal Hever fragment text reads. Does it end in a wa or a yod? And can we make that determination reasonably from the text itself? Let's take a look and see what Mr. Feigenbaum believes.
Psalm 22, verse 16 is another verse that often comes up in my discussions with Christians. I'm told that the psalm is all about Jesus' crucifixion, and that verse 16 is a direct and indisputable reference to Jesus' being nailed to the cross.
Now, as those of you who watch my CW Jot Talk 19 know, that's not my position. I believe it's possible and likely that the text has messianic implications and an application to Jesus or to someone like Jesus, and that the text we're going to consider is support on that view. But that even if it reads like a lion, I believe that it would have a similar interpretation or could have a similar application to someone like Jesus. So I realize Mr. Feigenbaum is not responding directly to me, and so he may be dealing with other Christians who have made more emphatic claims that he's addressing. I just want to make it clear that my position isn't so inflexible that I don't see multiple translation possibilities or even possible applications. I'm simply looking for the best available evidence.
The KJV, NASB, NIV, JUB, CSB, ESB, and a whole bunch of other English language biblical translations translate Psalm 22, verse 16, something along the lines of, "For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me, they have pierced my hands and feet." When pushed to explain how or why the Hebrew word ka'ari is translated as pierced, I'm often presented as proof with a fragment from 5/6 HEVPSA from the Dead Sea Scrolls collection, commonly known in Christian circles as the Nahal Hever fragment. Images like this one appear in many online articles and YouTube videos. In this fragment, the word ka'ari is written with a vav at the end of it instead of a yud, ka'aru. The claim is that ka'aru means pierced, and that while ka'ari does mean like a lion, the rabbis changed the vav to a yud in order to hide this blatantly obvious reference to Jesus' crucifixion.
And I don't necessarily believe that's the case. That is, that the rabbis deliberately changed the wa to a yod. But because, as we'll see, a wa and a yod are similar and very easy to write at the end of a word in a way that makes them even look more similar than they otherwise might when they are not used at the end of a word. So I don't believe that a change to ka'ari was necessarily done deliberately in order to hide a messianic application. In fact, as I explained in CW Jot Talk number 19, I believe that even like a lion makes pretty much the same it conveys the same meaning and hence is capable of the same or similar application, particularly when read in light of the rest of the text, which also has fulfillment in Jesus, at least according to the earliest Christian documents that we accept.
Well, a typical Jewish refutation of this slanderous claim is that ka'aru is a mistake. In addition, Jews further argue that there is no such word as ka'aru in Hebrew. They argue, correctly, that ka'aru appears nowhere in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and indeed it appears nowhere in Jewish literature.
And as I explained and showed in CW Jot Talk 19, and as you can read for yourself, if you have a Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia text of the Bible, which I'm sure Yosi Feigenbaum has, you can read the footnote to this verse and see for yourself that there are Masoretic texts that read ka'aru and karu. So it was hardly a term, that is ka'aru, unknown to the Jewish Masoretic scribes who used it in the text.
The Christian reply to this is that ka'aru is an alternate spelling of karu without the aleph, which means they opened or they dug. They then morphed this into pierced, and voila, proof from the most ancient Jewish writings is born.
And again, it's not about morphing it into another term. As I explained in CW Jot Talk 19, it's not a stabbing like with a sword. That's not the process that would be used either by a Roman soldier preparing someone for execution, since nailing someone to a piece of wood would require, just like any kind of carpentry or construction work, a starter hole, or you might not be able to use the limbs in the way you need to in order to complete the execution properly. And so even with a lion that's going to be scratching at a person, they're going to be more so digging out your hands and feet to try to get to the rest of your body, at least when interpreted metaphorically. But you can understand how that action happens literally, in the sense that a person would have to be fighting off a lion's attack, and so in the process, the lion would be scratching at or digging out your hands and feet. These aren't the kind of digging out should be understood in light of those actions, whether it's by a lion or with a sharp instrument, not a stabbing as with a sword. That doesn't fit the context.
Well, the problem is that both of these arguments totally ignore one very important thing: the writing style of the scrolls. You see, 2,000 years ago, the vav and the yod were kind of interchangeable. The reader understood whether the written vav or yod was actually a vav or yod from the context.
I agree with that last part, but it's not that they were interchangeable. They understood the difference between a wa and a yod. They just looked very similar. And so, other than cases like our subject text where there can be a question based on one single letter at the end of the word, it's usually much easier for a person familiar with a language like Hebrew to identify the term, even if a letter in the term is similar to another letter.
For example, if the word is supposed to be in first person singular, yet it ends with a vav, the reader knew that that vav was really a yud. Okay, first of all, let's look at the Nahal Hever fragment. As you can see, it's a mess. It's very hard to read.
It may be hard to read in places, but as you can see right here where my cursor is, here is a final yud. Before it is a Hebrew letter tau. Notice how the tau extends at the base over, and the scribe left a space between the ending of the tau and the base of the yod. We'll come back to that in a moment.
There's not much text for us to decipher. Still, we will come back to the fragment later. In order to demonstrate what I want to show you, what we need to do is we need to look at a clearer text. And what I did is I randomly chose Psalm 138 from the Great Psalm Scroll for us to examine.
And as I just showed, we actually can use the Nahal Hever text. It clearly showed the way that a final yod could be written. And we'll go back to that in a moment, as will Mr. Feigenbaum. But I'm not so sure that randomly picking a text was the best idea. Nevertheless, this is also a text that I showed in my CW Jot Talk 19 as evidence of the antiquity of the text of the Psalms, not necessarily for Psalm 22. And so what Yosi is going to show you here is the different ways in which a wa or a yod were written. Specifically, he's going to show you the way that the yod was written. That's what these arrows are for. And so, for example, if you look over here at the first arrow, and you compare it with the first arrow over here to the right, you can see that the transcription shows a short mark, which is a yod, versus a longer mark at the end or elsewhere in a word, like over here on line 4, last word, final letter, is a long line, and then it's vowel pointed. So he's showing you here that in the Dead Sea Scroll text, this arrow points to a final yod, just like it's shown in the transcription, and that it looks longer. And he's basically going to be saying that that's what you have in the Nahal Hever fragment, is a long yod, which is also the position of Rabbi Tovia Singer that I discussed last week. And so we'll discuss this process of writing a final yod more in a moment. But note again here, look for example at the area that I'm highlighting with my cursor, which if we count the arrows is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 arrows in. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so here you can see he's got it marked with a yod. And here it is over here. It looks a little longer, for example, than maybe at the beginning of a term. But you can see it leaves a space between the preceding letter's base ending and the ending of the final yod. So they were able to at times keep the space, and then at other times, for example, up here in the first instance, there is no space, because it's just easier to connect a term like yod when you're terminating it, and the preceding word has a base extension. Same over here in the third instance, which would be his line 3, final yod shown right here. Notice again, they're connected at the base. So the yods, and yet here in the preceding example, there's no connection, yet they're both yods. But notice again, there's not much difference in the spacing, and the extension from the preceding letter makes the connection very convenient to complete. And so it's not necessarily the best example to use, since if we go back to the Nahal Hever text, you'll be able to see more clearly, I believe, the way the scribe wrote. But let me go back to this letter here, or this word that I showed a moment ago when I was giving you an example of a yod. See how the divine name is circled right here where my cursor is? Now look to the word preceding the divine name. It's not highlighted with any arrow, but it's over here in his line 4. It's the term at the top. And here you have an example of a yod and a waw right next to each other. And this is a yod at the beginning of a word. And there's just not much difference between the yod and the waw. There is a difference though, just barely. And sometimes that difference is maintained like right here. And sometimes it's not. It's just easy to go up and down. And you had just written that letter with the extension out, and so it connected. And sometimes it doesn't connect, like right here. And here it's not connected. And here it is connected, because it's just easy to either hit or miss. It's not much of a difference. So let me allow Feigenbaum to continue, because he's going to go back to, and I'm going to go back to the Nahal Hever fragment. But that's why I don't believe this text is useful, in the sense that the fact that it shows yods at the end of words that appear to be long, they're not much different by comparison with the way the yod and the waw are used next to each other at the beginning of a word. And there are differences in terms of the separation of the use of the yod and a preceding letter with an extension at the base. So let's go back to the Nahal Hever fragment after Feigenbaum discussed this text further, where I think we'll find the best evidence to make our case.
There's actually quite a lot to learn from this image. You note that the text that I've circled, this is God's unutterable 4-letter name written.
I'm going to skip past that, not because the divine name's not important. It's just not the subject of our inquiry here. So I'm going to move to his minute 4 and second 28, where he resumes discussion of the subject of our video, which is the meaning and possible understanding of the term used in the Nahal Hever fragment of Psalm 22:16-17.
What I want you to do is to notice the red arrows. Each arrow in the scroll on the left corresponds to an arrow in the Masoretic text on the right. In every one of these cases, a final vav is used instead of a final yod. Now, not every word that ends in a yod in the Masoretic text on the right ends with a vav in the scroll on the left, but out of 17 words that end with a yod in the Masoretic text of this passage, 10 were written as a vav by the ancient scribe.
I wouldn't put it that way. It's just that they look the same for reasons I just explained. And that is the convenience and ease with which a final yod can be written to connect to the base extension of the preceding letter and therefore appear like a waw. And there's just not much difference between a normal yod and a normal waw when you compare them side by side in this text.
Now let's take a closer look at that Nahal Hever fragment. As you can see from this image of the fragment, the phenomenon of a final vav instead of a final yud occurs 2 additional times in this fragment as well.
Okay, so what he's saying is just like in the Psalm scroll we just looked at with the red arrows, you've got examples of final yods that look like they're longer or like vavs or waws. And so notice here, though, in his examples, you see the same phenomenon. Look, there's no connection. It's close. And it looks longer because of the extension of the tau, the preceding letter. It's less clear here, but even here, you can see it, the separation right there. Here you can see it even more so. Look at that. So clearly, they were able to keep a separation here more, it looks like, than here. And once again, you have the preceding tau making it look longer because of the extension at the base. Now, notice he uses these 2 examples, which are much less clear, but which even show that the final yod just appears longer or may even be written longer because of the ease with which it's terminatable. It terminates, I should say, at a point close to the base of the extension of the preceding letter. But look up here to the left. This is our subject term, ka'aru or ka'ari. This is the letter. It's either a wa or a yod. Why doesn't he use this as an example? Here's a final yod right there, immediately preceding our subject term. And look at the difference. This is the word, the letter he believes is a yod. Here is a yod. No one disputes that. Look at the difference. It's obvious. And so he goes over here to use 2 of the least clear examples, which themselves appear to show signs that because of the preceding letter being a tau, simply appear longer or may have been made longer because of the connection, the ease of connection at the base, than these examples. And so here in the much clearer line of letters, you can see the difference, and yet it wasn't used by Feigenbaum. So let me allow him to continue on this point.
In conclusion, the whole ka'ari versus ka'aru, like a lion versus pierced argument, is a waste of time. What's written in the Nahal Hever fragment is not ka'aru, rather ka'ari, even though what is written at the letter at the end appears to be a vav. It's a yud, certainly according to Quranic tradition, and the ancient reader knew this very well, and now you know it too.
Well, what we know is what we can see and what we just showed. And that is, if you look at our subject term, ka'aru or ka'ari, here's the letter. Here is the preceding word's final letter, which is a yod. Why didn't Feigenbaum simply compare those 2 letters? Instead, he goes down here, and even here appears closer to here It just, you can see the extension is longer than the Hebrew letter preceding the yod here. And so you don't get as close of an association and connection or the ease of extension. And that's why I believe it appears a little bit wider here. But let me show you even another example that Feigenbaum also did not present and that I believe shows clearly once again the difference between a vav, a wa. It's spoken of as a vav by many people who speak Hebrew today. But in ancient times it was a wa. And so look here, I'm showing you a digital image of the Dead Sea Scrolls on the top in the black and white. And in the color image below, it's right below it. It just looks a little less clear. And so you can see I've lined up the letters. If you look at, for example, these letters here, you can see also the extension right here. I'm going to try to line them up perfectly. So pretty much like that. Now, you see on the black and white image, I'm circling these two letters. They kind of look like number 4s. This one's a wa. This is a yod. Here they are right here in the color image. You can see them. It's just not as clear. But here's the wa. See how it extends all the way down? Just like right here. And here's the yod. Why didn't Feigenbaum show this? It shows clearly the way the Nahal Hever scribe wrote the yod in comparison to the wa. Look up here to the right. Here's another final yod. Notice again, it has a Hebrew letter tau with the extension at the base. No connection. But it looks closer because of the ease with which a connection could have been made, but the scribe stopped. But there has to be a conscious effort here because the extension at the base from the preceding letter. Here, you don't have that problem. You see the obvious comparative differences. Here, same thing. You can see the final ending of the term preceding our subject word and its use of a final yod, and simply compare it with what the subject term uses. That's a wa. That's not a yod.